Hey everyone, welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here again this week. And we continue on as we're looking ahead. And thank you for joining me. So this week, what we'll be covering is we'll be covering a passage in John 11, but all of this is done through the lens of All Saints Day, which is this Sunday. So this past week, we had Reformation Sunday, and I did that slightly differently than I thought I was going to. What I was trying to get at was, Reformation and big topics like that kind of feel kind of distant from us. They don't feel very personal. And we talk about things in the church that don't feel day to day, right? Sometimes we talk about loss, or we talk about perseverance, or we talk about humility or grace, or caring for each other, or any sort of thing where you kind of take a little nugget home, as a friend of mine used to say, a little nugget to kind of stick with you for the week, and kind of a daily reminder kind of a feel. And then there are other subjects that we talk about in the church that don't feel like that because they're larger. Maybe it's an idea like racism or sexism. Maybe it's an idea that's even like a theological concept, like the Trinity, or what does it mean to be saved, or something like that. These kind of broader topics. Sometimes they're theological, social justice kind of stuff, and they're good things to talk about, and they're things that we should be about, because that's the types of things that we saw Jesus do. Talk about the poor, and talk about relationships with other people who are not like us, and talk about political things, and that kind of stuff. And we have to find ways of making those things personal. And the way that I try to do that is that, whenever we're talking about these subjects, then let's take this first commandment example, which is what the passage was about, and apply that to how we think through those things. Love God and love neighbor is what we were talking about. And so when I'm thinking through those bigger topics, how does it help me love God more completely? Would God, think of me as loving if I chose to do this or this? Am I loving my neighbor well when I choose to, this idea or this idea? And would my neighbor say that I am a loving person to them? That was one of my takeaways that I didn't really expect. But, do we spend a whole lot of time wondering if my neighbor thinks of me as loving? Because we can talk about, well, I'm trying to love my neighbor the best I can, and what they do with that, is what they do with that. But, do they look at me and see a loving person? I think it's a pretty good conversation to have in the church, and try to figure out, what that means for us as Christians. And so we explored that, and you can apply that kind of idea and thinking to lots of stuff. So anyway, that's where we kind of landed this past week. But this one is a shift from that, obviously, as we talk about All Saints. And All Saints Day is one of those days that I think has a mix of emotions, because I, like you, have people in my life that I remember on days like that. Some of them have maybe passed away recently in the past year, and here at Northmont we've had folks that we all know and love who have passed on, and those are kind of raw, fresh emotions. But then it also brings up other folks in my life who have passed away, my grandparents, or friends of mine who have passed away, and and that just kind of brings a lot of those feelings up to the surface, especially when I think about those folks in my life who have had a lot of influence, who showed me what it means to be a person of faith, and what that looks like, and what it can look like. And that's probably what it does for you too. And so, this passage that we're looking at, which is the resurrection of Lazarus, it's a pretty direct parallel, right? You don't have to go fishing for why I chose this passage, or why the lectionary did. Why is this an important thing? The other passage that we'll be looking at on Sunday is Revelation 21. So Revelation 21 and this passage in John are kind of paired together, and for good reason, because we think about them. We think about death, of course, in kind of eternal ways, and those two point to that very directly. I think the other thing too that I always find really amazing about All Saints Day is the way that we can look at communion from a unique perspective. Because communion, which we'll of course have this Sunday, communion has that element of looking back and looking forward all at the same time. You have thinking about the sacrifice of Christ, the life of Christ, the death of Christ, and then the promise, of the flesh and the blood, the promise of Christ, that eternal promise. And both those things are there. And I like to step back because we think of Jesus, and because we think of communion, and we think of what that represents in kind of in eternal language. We think about eternity. We think about something beyond. We think about God who is beyond time. Because that's true, because that's the context of which we take communion, that we realize that when we're taking communion, that thing that we're doing represents something much greater than the one particular moment that we're in right this second. And I hold really something that's really important to me when I think about that is stepping back and thinking about the fact that I'm celebrating in something, because I'm celebrating and remembering and honoring something eternal. That means that I'm not just in that moment with the people in the room, that in some ways I can imagine that I'm in that moment with everyone who God loves. That table is so long and wide that's it's a bigger experience than that one place. We do that. We say that too on World Communion Sunday when we think about the fact that we're celebrating that with the world. But especially on All Saints Day when we're thinking about those who we have lost, I like to step back for a moment and just think about the fact that I'm at this table with all of those who have come before me. So I get to take communion in some ways with my grandparents and their parents and my friend who died a few years ago. And I also get to take communion then with, people, my children's children who I'll never meet, but it's kind of a neat way of understanding, what we're about, that we think about ourselves, not just as, people who are here for a moment in time, but that we're doing that sort of in the way that God sees us, because God sees us not just in a moment in time. God sees all of that at once, and we can try to imagine that with God, and that's a neat experience. And so I think about that a lot on All Saints Day, especially. So this passage here in John is, I think, an important one for a lot of obvious reasons. The hope element to it, what Jesus is able to do and overcome. But then I think too, just getting a chance to see how this event affects Jesus personally is fascinating. And so let's kind of get into it for a few minutes. So this is a story that and it's it's a story that leads into Easter often. The story of Lazarus is usually talked about like somewhere in Lent. And, obviously it has that kind of forward thinking, kind of a foreshadowing of what will happen with Jesus, right? And of course, there's a difference between the small resurrection that we see in this story with Lazarus and what we see ultimately with Jesus. Because Lazarus will be raised from the dead, but he will, of course, still die later. He'll die some other time. And that, of course, is not the same for Jesus. And that's one of the things that I think that over and over again we see in the person of Jesus, but also in the theology I think that we're supposed to hold on to by viewing and understanding his life. That the Gospels give you this sort of once and for all idea many, many times. So when we think about baptism as being like a cleansing once and for all, right? When we think about the sacrifice of Jesus being a once and for all. And then when we think about the resurrection of Jesus, that even in that way, Lazarus will be raised, but then die again, and then, raised again. Well, that won't happen more than once for Jesus, and kind of a once and for all resurrection, right? And so that theme is kind of in there as we look at the passage. So anyway, before I start into John 11, I think it's important just to kind of give the concept happening in this story a little bit of context. You and I know that one of the people in the Old Testament that Jesus gets compared to often, besides Moses is a good moment of comparison. An obscure one is Melchizedek, which happens in the book of Hebrews. And so if you want to look at the comparison between Melchizedek, who was a king and priest early on in Genesis, and Jesus, because Jesus is called the high priest, as you've heard me say. That's another Old Testament comparison. But one of them that has many, many parallels that I'm not going to go through all of them here is Elijah. Elijah, of course, is the prophet, one of the prophets with Moses that Jesus meets at the Transfiguration. And there are a lot of kind of parallels and overlaps between the person of Elijah and Jesus. And Elijah also never dies in the sense that we think of death. Elijah is taken up into the clouds in kind of an ascension kind of a way, right? But we see in Elijah a lot of these parallels with Jesus. Someone who spoke truth to power, someone who suffered in the wilderness, someone who did miracles, someone who was a prophet, and someone who was able to, at least once, resurrect someone, lift someone from the dead. And if you want the reference, and I won't go through the entire story, but the reference is in 1 Kings 17, and there's a widow that has been helping Elijah, and her son falls ill and dies, and Elijah is able to raise him to life. And I like to make sure that when we're talking about these stories that pertain to Jesus, I usually like to make sure that we know the reference from the Torah, that we understand the Old Testament reference, because these things don't happen in a vacuum. So it's not like Jesus would have raised someone from the dead and people would have said, wow, that's never happened before, because it had happened before. So it's a way for those people who are experiencing Jesus live and in person of making this connection between these great, wonderful prophets of old and who Jesus is. And that may not be as important for you and I, but it's important for them. Because if you're trying to understand this one as Messiah, then this Messiah comes with kind of great power, responsibility, the fortitude to speak that truth and to power and to be against it. That is able to lead in a charismatic way, is able to do wonderful signs and miracles. Like, those elements are certainly there in someone that we see in Elijah, and they're also there in Jesus. And so, a connection to Elijah, who would have been one of the most honored prophets in all of Israel, was a big deal. So seeing Jesus in that light is only solidifies for many who he is in that moment. So 1 Kings 17, the last half of that chapter, you can read that portion. So here we have Jesus and Lazarus, and I won't make all the references now, but we have seen a relationship between Lazarus and Jesus more than once, and I'm sure that on Sunday I'll kind of reference that. And that's important because that's another parallel between him and Elijah. Elijah was raising someone from the dead who they had a relationship with, and this is similar. Jesus has a relationship with his family. It's why Jesus weeps when he recognizes that Lazarus is dead. And Martha and Mary, his siblings, also know Jesus. This is a friend of theirs. This is someone who has been with them before. And so there's something personal to it. And so when we talk about resurrection and we talk about death and we talk about those we remember, I think talking about that kind of personal connection is comforting. And you see that here in this story. So John 11, and I'm just going to read 38 through 44, but really the whole story is really the entire chapter. So if you want to go back and look at the story, I would start back all the way to the beginning of chapter 11, and then and really reading all the way to 44. And I think it's a good reminder too that this story happens when Jesus and his disciples are kind of in hiding. They know that something is about to go down. They know that that the powers that be are kind of rallying the troops, and that the death of Jesus is a very real possibility. Jesus already knew it was going to happen, but his disciples were still getting their minds around it. And so they had to travel towards Jerusalem to get to Lazarus. And that felt kind of, that was an anxious thing for the disciples, because it's like, wait a minute, you're headed towards the fire. Like you're walking into something here. And that's kind of what we see in the verses that come after this one. So like in John 11:45, the subtitle I have is the plot to kill Jesus. He's headed towards Bethany, and Bethany is kind of a suburb of Jerusalem. And then there's the triumphal entry, and then Jesus predicts his death again. So it's kind of march in that direction. And so on his way to the place where he would die, Jesus resurrects someone. That juxtaposition is, I don't think, unintentional. So that's there as well. So we're going to read this little section here about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Okay. So starting in verse 38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. That's typical, but I think the image of Lazarus in there and Jesus and the tomb or the stone being rolled away, that's not unintentional either. So it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? I think that little detail where Martha, and we know Martha in one setting to be kind of the organizer, keeping the house. Like if you remember the story of Martha and Mary, Mary is like sitting at Jesus's feet and just absorbing everything he's saying, and Martha's the one who's like trying to like be a good host and like care for Jesus through hospitality, and Mary's not doing any of that. And so, Martha's taking great care to love Jesus, love him as her neighbor, so to speak, through hospitality, and she gets really frustrated. This kind of feels like, yeah, that sounds like something Martha would say. Like, Jesus, let me be a good host to you even in this moment. If we roll away that stone, this is not going to be the most pleasant experience of your life. Are you sure you want to do this? And, I think there's a kind of two ways of looking at that. One, Martha shows great care in saying, look, as much as I want this to happen, I can't overlook that this could mean something that, one, maybe doesn't honor the memory of my brother very much. Because if you open this and this is the last thing you remember, as I open this roll the stone away and there was this smell of death in the air, like, is that really the way you want to remember your friend? Like, is that a good honoring thing for my brother? Like, is that really what we want to do here? So that's one way of thinking about it. Like her caring for the memory of her brother and caring for Jesus. The other the other kind of piece of that is, resurrection, the promise we have in Jesus. As much as we might proclaim it and talk about it and point to it and pray for it, actually accepting that God can change the world around us is sometimes harder to accept than we are willing to admit. And we kind of settle for the way the world is. Often we don't want to put ourselves out there. We don't want to set ourselves up for disappointment. When we think about world peace or the end of racism or whatever like that, those seem like kind of pie in the sky things, like when we have to live in the real world. And I think Martha is kind of in that in-between place, where it's like, well, I want to believe that this can all be good, but I'm also kind of worried about the here and now and what's happening, and like, is this really practical, and does this really make sense, and like, are we biting off more than we can chew here, and is this, that kind of feeling also can be applied to this moment where we're thinking, I know we all talk about resurrection and that things can be better and whatever, but is that realistic? Should we really be going to this extent for something that maybe doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon? That's a good lesson for church too. Something to think about, even if that's not where I end up going for the sermon. Just an idea for you to think about. Okay, those are just some things I wanted to kind of run by you. As that's what first look is. It's the thought process, right? That's what we're doing. All right, so moving on to this, in verse 39, he hears the critique. Jesus says, "Take away the stone." "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been in there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Are we always ready to see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And that's the end of the story, which I've always found kind of fascinating. That's where they just kind of cut it off, because then they're moving on. They heard about this story, and they're moving on. And in the life of Martha and Mary and Lazarus, we never really find out anything about Lazarus's experience or what it's like to realize that you're back to life again. Because you can't assume that you all just go back to the way things were. I don't know. I always find that fascinating, that we don't get more of that story and that we're just kind of left imagining what that would be like. What would that be like for Mary and Martha to have him back, and how many people would give every single thing that they had to have that experience. And it's that kind of hopefulness, I think, about where things go, where we go when we die, or where our loved ones are, that we hold on to for lots of different reasons. And some of it is just heartache, because those reunions are precious. The idea of the reunions are precious. And maybe that's a little bit different for all of us. And maybe that's why, on some level, we don't hear what that was like for Martha and Mary and Lazarus to realize that they were back together again, at least not in that moment. And and maybe it's just such a personal experience that all of us, all we can really do is just hope for something similar in the future. I don't know. Just something I was thinking about as I was looking at this is just, that not everything is terribly relatable. But anyway, that's kind of where I started with this passage. Is just thinking about, what those experiences